Right, well, we're continuing where we started, from where we started last week, looking at some characters from the Bible. And we started last week with Adam, and we're not doing this alphabetically if your alphabet's very good, because we're on Abraham this week. So we're gonna move around a bit, both alphabetically and chronologically as well. But this week we're looking at Abraham, and well, let's read from Hebrews chapter 11 if you've got your Bible with you. We're going to read from that passage looking at faith. And there's, as we well know, some verses there that refer to Abraham. So Hebrews 11 from verse 8. And it says, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking ahead to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father, because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore." It's been said that faith is not believing in spite of the evidence. Faith is obeying in spite of the consequences. I don't know if you've heard that before. I quite like that. Faith is not believing in spite of evidence, it's obeying in spite of the consequences. That means that we do the right thing, we follow God, we do what he says, we behave as we should, and we leave the rest to God. The consequences of our actions, we leave it with God. We leave him to work out the results. All we are called to do is to live lives of obedience and to follow what is revealed to us. The Bible has many examples of this. When Daniel's 3 friends were facing death for refusing to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue, they said, "The God we serve is able to save us, but even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." So even if things don't work out as they wanted, they said, we're going to do the right thing and we're going to leave the rest to God. We're going to leave the consequences of our actions to God. That's faith, in obeying in spite of consequences. It's the kind of faith that we see in the life of Abraham. It's not that Abraham was perfect. We know full well that he wasn't, and he did some silly things at times. We're not going to focus on the silly things. We're going to focus on the faith, the things he did by faith, and some of the principles that we can bring out of this record of the things that he did by faith. Faith doesn't mean sitting down in a comfortable bubble. Believing God means standing up and facing the impossible challenge and leaving the consequences of obeying God's will with God. Like Joshua crossing the river Jordan and conquering Canaan, or David standing up and defeating Goliath. Esther in the palace saying, "If I perish, I perish." Or Mary saying, "I am the Lord's servant, may it be to me as you have said." Abraham's one of the greatest examples of this faith in Scripture. No matter what God called him to do, he believed that God's calling involved God's enabling, and he obeyed by faith. So, the first thing we're going to think about is when we can't see the way. Something we learn from Abraham is that Abraham obeyed when he couldn't see the way forward. It was by faith, says Hebrews 11 verse 8. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave his home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. At the age of 75, Abraham said farewell to his home, and with a stop off in Haran on the way, he headed for Canaan. The biblical record's all very matter of fact about this. It says that God called him and he went. But what an upheaval. What a journey into the unknown. He didn't know where he was going. And he would have had to have obeyed a day at a time, even a step at a time. There was no Google to plan, no Airbnbs to book ahead, no sat-nav to show the way, no plane, train or car, just a journey into the unknown. Abraham didn't know where he was going, but he trusted God to lead the way, and God led him. He didn't let him down. Called to an unknown future, a future he couldn't see, a future he hadn't got mapped out. He obeyed by faith. This is the act of faith, not knowing the outcome, but trusting and going anyway. He went. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. I'm not going to read it all, just the first bit and the last bit. The Lord said to Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Verse 4, so Abraham left as the Lord had told him. God said, go and I'll show you. So Abraham went, and God revealed the destination. God always gives the light that we need to follow his will. It's not always the light that we would want, not always when we would want it, but God gives the light that we need. Abraham left not knowing where he was going, but he got to where he needed to be. We have to remember that, don't we? He set off not knowing where he was going, but he got to where he needed to be. Think about your own life. How much of it is mapped out? How much do we plan ahead, think ahead, kind of map out what's going to happen, even subconsciously? This is where I'm headed. This is what's going to happen. But we know that that's not the way it works. James warned his hearers, saying, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money, while you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. And of course, when he says that, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, that doesn't mean you just tag on that phrase. It means that we actively think like that our lives are in God's hands. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen next year. We don't even know what's going to happen, the end of this Bible study. But we trust the one who does know what's going to happen. We trust the one who calls us and will take us to where we need to be. So like Abraham, there are times when we can't see the way, but in those times, that's when we need to trust God. The second thing, when we face difficult people, when people are difficult, anybody ever met somebody who's difficult? It's not a show of hands. Keep your hands down. When Abraham was called by God to leave his home, he was commanded to leave his extended family as well. God said, leave your family. But he took his father, his wife, and his nephew Lot with him. After Terah died in Haran, Abraham and Sarah resumed their journey, and they took Lot with them. After a trip to Egypt because of a famine, not one of Abraham's finest moments, he returned. And because they were quite rich, they had large flocks and lots of stuff. They separated to provide enough pasture for the flocks. Lot chose the fruitful plains, whether he was just looking at the physical and he saw the good pasture and he saw the plenty of water, or because he already had an eye on Sodom. We can't be certain, but eventually he moved closer to the city, gave up his tents and his nomadic life, and became a resident of the city. Genesis 13 verse 12 says, Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Then in chapter 14 verse 12, Lot was living in Sodom. When 4 kings invaded and captured the cities of the plain, Lot was taken prisoner, and Abraham was not. It's ironic, isn't it, that Abraham in his tent was safer than Lot in the walled city. There's a thought to dwell upon there, I think. We're safer in the seemingly uncertain will of God. Not that it is uncertain, but it can seem like that at times. We're safer in the seemingly uncertain will of God than we are in the seemingly certain way of the world. The solid things that we see around us, the things that we can touch and hold. It's safer to stick with God. Lot received exactly what he deserved, but Abraham didn't abandon him. By faith, Abraham rallied the troops and rescued the inhabitants of Sodom. And he did it for Lot's sake. Lot may well have not done the same thing for Abraham if it was the other way round. This experience should have warned Lot to return to the tents, to return to the God of Abraham. But he didn't get the message. He moved back to the city. When God decided to destroy Sodom and the other cities of the plain, it was Abraham outside of Sodom who first got the message, not Lot, who was sitting at the gates with the other leaders of the city. Psalm 25 tells us the Lord confides in those who fear him. And that wasn't Lot. Knowing what kind of people lived in Sodom, most of us might have been happy to see them wiped out. Maybe not openly, but maybe quietly in our hearts. But Abraham didn't give up. He didn't give up on Lot. He interceded for the city and the people. These were people that he'd met with. These were people he'd witnessed with and told them about the true and living God. But primarily he was thinking of his nephew. The Lord destroyed Sodom, but for the sake of Abraham, he permitted Lot to escape. Genesis 19 verse 29, so when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Abraham's faith and faithfulness meant salvation for Lot and for his daughters. Lot's incest that followed led to the founding of the Ammonite and Moabite nations, people who would be enemies of God's people. After all that Abraham had done, Lot doesn't repay him well. If you've ever sacrificed to help somebody who wasn't grateful but turned right round and got into more trouble, you're in good company with Abraham. If you've ever prayed for people in trouble only to see them doing everything they can to make it difficult for God to answer your prayers. You're in good company with Abraham. If you've ever done the right thing and left the consequences to God. It takes faith to pray with Jesus. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Luke 23. God calls us to love the unlovely, doesn't he? He calls us to love those who are difficult. That's what Abraham did with his nephew. He doesn't tell us it'll always work out the way we want, but he's the one who takes care of the results. We live by faith and we leave the results to God. What about this one? When we have to wait. The life of faith is not just about God using us to minister to other people. It's also the Lord's ministry to us personally. It's also the things that he's doing in us. He wants us to experience his love and receive his grace so that we can accomplish those purposes and plans that God has for us. We walk by faith, but we also wait by faith. And the waiting is often as important as the walking. And it's certainly more of a challenge to us. In Genesis 15, Abraham was afraid and uncertain and frustrated, and he asked the Lord why he hadn't sent this son that he had promised to him and Sarah. Incidentally, this is the first time that God says, don't be afraid in the Bible. God permits these times of waiting so that we might seek him and he might reaffirm his promises to us, those promises that he's made sometime in our past. He tells us not to be afraid, but to trust and to believe. Not to be afraid, but to leave the consequences of our lives of faith to him. The Lord made a covenant with Abraham that night and assured him ownership of the land, even though the land was possessed at that time by the pagan nations. It was a tough experience for Abraham. It's hard to wait, but what an encouragement to his faith. But as time went on, Abraham and Sarah became impatient, and Sarah began to make her own plans for helping the Lord to provide that promised child. Genesis 16 verses 1 and 2 says, Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abraham agreed to what Sarai said. Faith is living without scheming. It's trusting and leaving the results to God. Abraham should have said no, but he didn't. Abraham trusted God in the darkness, but now in the light of day he doubted God. Waiting on the Lord's essential for the growing life of faith. Running ahead of the Lord, making our own plans, scheming, trusting our own resources, our own wisdom, or anything else only creates problems. Problems that mean missing God's best for our lives, missing the blessings that he has for us. Think of all the trouble that came as a result of this scheming and this helping God to work things out. When we have to wait, it's part of a life of faith, isn't it? It's important that we wait well. The next thing is this. When we have to give things up. When we have to give things up that we love. God kept his word as he always does. And in his time, Abraham and Sarah had the son that they were promised. God instructed them to call his name Isaac, meaning laughter, because both Abraham and Sarah had laughed. They laughed over the prospect of having a baby at their place in life. Genesis 17 verse 17 says, Abraham fell face down, he laughed, and he said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Verse 19, then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. There may be many tears along the way, but ultimately the life of faith is a life of joy, or it should be a life of joy. How strange it was that God should ask Abraham to sacrifice the very son that he had given them, the one on whom the promise rested, the one on whom the future of the Jewish nation rested, the one on whom the salvation of a lost world rested. The first time that the word love is found in the Bible is Genesis 22 verse 2. You're looking that up now, aren't you, to see if it's true? I think it is. It's where the Lord affirms Abraham's love for his only son. Genesis 22 verse 2, then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. The first time the word love is found in the New Testament is Matthew chapter 3, verse 17, where the Heavenly Father affirms his love for his Son. A voice from heaven said, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Why would the Lord share a gift of love with Abraham and Sarah and then ask Abraham to kill the boy? This was Abraham's greatest test of faith. But the faith that won't stand a test isn't real faith. And faith is doing what's right, obeying the Lord, and leaving the consequences to God. The tests that God permits us to go through help us to discover whether our faith is true or whether there's a problem with it, whether we're standing solidly on God's character and upon his promises, or whether we're not. Abraham focused on God's promises. He trusted God to work things out. He trusted that God had a plan. He didn't know how it was going to work out, but he trusted God. It's been well said that God didn't want Abraham's son. He wanted Abraham's heart. I think it's a law of the Christian life that we must give back to the Lord whatever he gives to us. Otherwise, those blessings become idols to us. Things that come between us and the Lord. But sometimes God then gives those things back to us, as he did to Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed God and gave up Isaac, but then he received him back. In Hebrews 11, 17 to 19, it says, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. When God calls us to surrender things to him, the most precious things that we possess, we do it by faith, knowing that the only way to receive it back as a blessing and not a burden is to give it up in the first place. So we must, like Abraham, be prepared to put aside everything and anything for God and trust him to take care of the rest. When we have to give things up, it's difficult. But we trust God who is bigger. We trust God who is able. We trust God who can provide us with what we need when we need it. The next thing, when we face loss. When Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, he got him back. But he faced death again sometime later with Sarah. Genesis 23 records the first funeral and the first tears in the Bible. Sarah was a woman of faith, just as Abraham was a man of faith. In Hebrews 11, verse 11, in the margin notes, it says, by faith, even Sarah, who was past age, was enabled to bear children because she believed. It's slightly different from the main text, which focuses on Abraham, but this focuses on Sarah. But undoubtedly, she was a woman of faith too. They were a team as they served the Lord. Abraham's tears were evidence of his great love for his wife. God's people face loss the same way as everybody in the world faces loss, except that we don't face loss in the same way as everybody in the world faces loss. We face loss differently. In the New Testament, Paul reminds the Thessalonian believers in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. This is the ultimate trusting of God with the results. Abraham honored Sarah and he buried her. The cave he purchased ultimately held the bodies of Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, and Jacob. It was a full tomb. Our faith is founded not on a full tomb, though, but upon an empty tomb. Jesus conquered death, we're told in 1 Corinthians 15. The longer we live, the longer we walk through life, the more loved ones and friends leave us to be with the Lord. If the Lord doesn't return in our lifetime, we'll go to be with them. But we don't fear what will happen. We have nothing to fear because we can trust God even with death. Psalm 48 verse 14 says, for this God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide even to the end. Isn't that wonderful? This God is our God forever and ever, even to the end. Linked with this is the last one, when we reach the end. Abraham lived to be 175. He'd been walking with the Lord for 100 years. There's not many people who can say that. He died in faith just as he had lived in faith, anticipating entering the glorious city on which his eyes had been fixed since the day that God had called him. Hebrews 11 verses 13 to 16 says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country that they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Before Abraham died, he wanted to be sure that Isaac had the right wife. He wanted to be sure that he had the wealth, the resources that he needed for himself and for the generations to come. So knowing that he would die soon, he transferred his wealth to Isaac. Genesis 25 verse 5 says, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. Then he sent his chief servant to the town of Nahor, where his relatives lived, to find the wife that would be chosen for Isaac. The account given in Genesis 24 reveals the love of God, the providence of God, faithfulness of God in keeping his promises. Abraham's faith and the steward's faithfulness combined to bring Isaac just the wife that he needed. Abraham finished well. He didn't blow everything in a final selfish goodbye the way that you hear some people do. He dies by faith, having left a legacy, having left provision for Isaac. Because Abraham was concerned about the next generation. He was concerned about the ongoing promises of God. And so he made provision for them spiritually and materially. Isaac, Jacob, the whole of the Jewish nation were blessed because of faithful Abraham. True faith overcomes circumstances that doesn't fear death. So we see in all these things, when we can't see the way, when we face difficult people, when we have to wait, when we have to give things up, when we face loss, when we reach the end. These are all tough things that Abraham faced, and they're tough things that we have to face. But if we would trust God and leave the results to him, leave the consequences to him, he is able to do what he wants to do, what he needs to do, what he's promised to do in our lives. And not only in our lives, but through our lives as well. To those who will come after us, to those who we rub shoulders with in this life. When we live lives of faith, it affects those around us. And it leaves a legacy behind us. Now we've got a few minutes, and I've got a couple of questions. I kind of like the questions that we had in the Romans course. So I've got a couple of questions for you to think about, just for a few minutes. So maybe you just want to maybe we could go into just two groups very quickly. There's two questions that are on the screen. First one is this: faith is not believing in spite of evidence. Faith is obeying in spite of consequences. Do you agree? How have you experienced this? And the second one, pick one of the sections when we can't see the way, when we have to wait, when we have to give up what we love. How has God helped you through that season, and what did you learn? So we've got about 4. Just have a quick feedback after.